Thank you for joining us today as we mark International Day of Democracy with the theme Solidarity and Sustainability, Civil Society and Youth as Drivers of Democracy. My name is Isabel Bosman-Burnett. I'm a researcher here at the South African Institute of International Affairs, SAIIA, and I'd like to welcome you to this webinar that we are co-hosting with the Embassy of Sweden, who are our partners on this very interesting project that we conducted roughly over the last year and a half on exactly this topic, how civil society and youth can drive democracy. Thank you for taking the time to join us. To officially kick things off, I would like to hand over to a representative from the Embassy of Sweden in Pretoria, Deputy Head of Mission, Mr. Christian Olsen-Sellerud. Over to you, Christian.
Thank you so much, Isabel, and good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here today with you online. And thank you so much for having me and allowing me to say a few words. I promise to be brief so that we can get into the real nitty-gritty and the discussions on the insights of this report. Let me begin by saying that Sweden is proud to have been a long-standing partner with SAIIA, supporting SAIIA's role as a leading research and policy institute. Isabel, you mentioned that this is a specific project that's been ongoing for a year and a half. Unfortunately, myself, I can't take any credit for that, but I'm extremely happy to be in South Africa as of a month ago to continue some of the work that my predecessors have done. And I look forward to even more interactions with both you as an organization and everybody else online. The collaboration that we have, it really reflects our shared commitment to an evidence-based dialogue, strong institutions, democratic values in South Africa, in the region, at a global level. So we're very proud to support this particular initiative. And as you know, Sweden views democracy, human rights, and the rule of law as a foundation for sustainable peace and inclusive development. This commitment is central to our engagement in South Africa, as well as across the SADC region, and it has been a central component of our relations to much of the African continent for the past decades. It's a relationship between Sweden and many African countries that stretches back 60, 70 years, and these principles have always been at the forefront of that. I think, we look at shared responsibility and the need to uphold democracy. South Africa and Sweden, we share a historic bond rooted in the struggle for freedom and justice. Today, that bond carries forward in our joint responsibility to ensure that democratic principles such as accountability, inclusion, respect for human rights remains strong, remains resilient, and becomes responsive to the needs of our respective peoples. So civil society organizations are crucial for holding the governments accountable, for educating citizens on their rights, and amplifying the voices of various communities. This is just as true in Sweden as it is in South Africa, as for any other country in the world. And we recognize that strengthening that civic space is essential to reversing what we see as democratic backsliding, and which unfortunately is very much identified as well as some of the insights in the report that we're discussing today. So, the perspectives of young people in South Africa show both disillusionment, but also determination. Sweden believes that youth inclusion, political education, civic engagement must be prioritized to ensure democracy delivers across generations. This is a priority at the embassy, where we have a strong engagement, including through our youth advisor program. And I'm also happy to see here today on the panel one of our youth advisors, Ruth Kasanga. We have not met in person, Ruth, but I look forward to it, and I hope it happens sooner rather than later. Sweden's partnership with South Africa through initiatives such as the South Africa-Sweden University Forum, SASUF, demonstrates the value of cross-border collaboration. By linking academics, students, and institutions across both of our countries, SASUF shows how knowledge exchange can strengthen democratic resilience, civic engagement, and inclusive development. So again, it's a pleasure to join you all today, and I look forward to hear more about some of those insights from the report, and more than anything, to hear your various views on it. Some of those insights are rather concerning, but there are others that are also reason to feel hope. In any case, I really want to underline that from my perspective, and I know from Sweden's perspective, youth participation is not only important in these discussions, it's a prerequisite, as the youth of today are both the leaders of today, but also the leaders of the future. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to say a few brief words, and back to you, Isabel.
Thank you so much, Christian. I think those were insightful remarks, and ties in quite nicely, I think, with the theme that we selected for this year, focusing on solidarity and sustainability. We, of course, did that to, in part, link to the G20, because it is such a big year for South Africa under the theme Solidarity, Equality and Sustainability, but also because it highlights key threads of the forthcoming report that Christian has now mentioned, and that I will be presenting on a little bit before we engage in a discussion with our other speakers. In that solidarity and sustainability, especially as you said now, Christian, democracy delivering across generations, that sustainability element, something that we would really like to highlight. So I will be joined in the discussion shortly after the presentation I am going to give now, by Nosipho Dube. She is a Chatham House Common Futures Conversations member, as well as Communications Officer here at SAIIA. We'll also be joined by Ms. Hope Dlamini, Youth and Sustainable Development Advocate, Global Citizen Fellow, and AU-EU Chapter Activist. I will also be joined by Ruth Kasanga, part of the Youth Advisors Program at the Embassy of Sweden in Pretoria, and then by Mr. John Frinjoa. He's a Program Officer under the Policy Influencing and Advocacy Unit at the West Africa Civil Society Institute, WACSI, based in Ghana. There we go. So I would like to give a little bit of background to the one part of this webinar today. And this was a project started officially started in March 2024. And it was titled, and this is the same title of the forthcoming SAIIA Special Report, Democracy and Civil Society in Southern Africa, Strengthening Democracy by Bolstering Civil Society Solidarity. And the driving question for this was, does the Southern African region need a dedicated cross-border civil society network that focuses exclusively on democratic enhancement? So we investigated cross-border civil society networks, especially those that work on and for democratic enhancement. And some of the activities that this included were youth consultations that we conducted in March 2024 under the Chatham House rule. We did some field research in Ghana, where we spoke to several civil society networks or institutions in such networks, and then collating all those findings in a special report, which you will get a preview of today. And once it is available, because you have registered for this webinar, we can share this report once it is published with you directly. So these are some photos from the youth consultations that I mentioned. These were held over 2 days in March in 2024. And the aim was really to link into what Christian said in his opening remark, speak to youth or young people as the future leaders of the continent, of the region, to get their sense of where the issues lie, what can be done to address it, and how they feel about democracy and democratic governance generally. So I'm going to do a rough kind of chapter by chapter overview, just to show you what you can expect from the report. And we begin from the starting point of the Year of Democracy, 2024, which saw around 49% of the world's population engaged in elections. And a key contribution of this first chapter is to draw focus on the idea that democracy revolves around more than just elections. Yes, the procedure is important, but the substance also matters. And then also that concerns were raised about the state of democracy generally for a number of years now, because the number of countries that are registering democratic declines is higher than the number showing advances. Then on the second chapter, and that's where I would like to focus the majority of my presentation today, we flesh out the youth perspectives on democracy that we gained from these informal consultations. So over 2 days, SAIIA researchers consulted with young people aged 18 to 35 to gauge their perceptions of democracy and democratic governance in Africa, in Southern Africa. Youth at SAIIA was also deeply involved in this. We relied on cluster groups. So we had a big group of between 20 and 30 participants. And this big group was split into smaller cluster groups. Each group had a facilitator, and each group was then given a question to discuss related to 3 broad themes: democracy, human rights, and civil society. And they would then come back to the wider group, and then there would be an ideas exchange. There was also live note-taking that we relied on so that we could tie together common threads. And we had both online and in-person participation for these events. So as I mentioned, 3 categories: democracy, human rights, and civil society. Under democracy, we asked the questions: what do you think are the biggest threats to democracy in your country or in others? Do you think people still believe in democracy? Are they included and heard in the current political system? Do you think there's a viable alternative to democracy? What do you understand democracy to be? Do you think democracy succeeded or failed in your country? Is democracy more than voting? And how could young people be better included in democratic processes? Under the human rights category, we asked, do you think Southern African democracies uphold human rights? What do you understand human rights to be? Are they universal or Western in nature? Is democracy the best form of government for promoting human rights? And what can be done to better defend human rights? And finally, under the third category, civil society, we asked, how would you rate voter education by civil society organizations in your country? Do civil society organizations cater for your needs and expectations? What should civil society organizations stop doing, start doing, and continue doing? Is civil society doing enough to support democracy? And finally, does civil society need to change the way it does things with regard to strengthening democracy? I'm not going to go into detail on each of those questions, but I would like to highlight some that I think stand out under each of the categories. So in terms of threats that were identified by young people in these consultations, there are 5 broad threats. The first is youth exclusion and apathy. And what was specifically highlighted there is that youth is losing trust in the ability of democracy to change things, and limitations on civil society organizations curb political education and politically active youth. The second threat identified was technology, in particular artificial intelligence and micro-targeting on social media that has been facilitated by artificial intelligence. A third threat was transparency and accountability. Young people specifically highlighted that proportional representation electoral systems diminishes individual accountability of politicians, i.e., rather than being accountable to the people, politicians are accountable to their parties. Then they also highlighted the definition of democracy as a potential threat area, in that it assumes equality, and this is a misconception, and that civil society organizations do not have an equal playing field. Finally, lack of access to development was highlighted as a threat to democracy, and there specifically was discussed that democracy has not delivered on the promises of development. This failure to deliver on socioeconomic goods is leading to disillusionment. Disillusionment with democracy opens a gap for alternative governance models, and disputed elections diminish the power of democracy. To remedy these threats, young people suggested to us that there should be greater investment in civil society, and civil society organizations should be given broader platforms for engagement. Socioeconomic development should also be more prioritized. We should govern and use technology responsibly. And finally, they suggested that political outreach and education programs for youth from primary school and up could help address the exclusion and apathy threat. On the question of whether people still believe in democracy, participants agreed that trust in democratically elected governments is diminishing, but overall, people still believe in the idea of democracy. However, they highlighted that there is a demographic deficit. And when reading the paper, you will see that this also links with some of the answers we got from civil society organizations when we were conducting field research in Ghana. Support for democracy is most at risk of declining among Africa's youth. During these consultations, one participant also warned against what they called the trap of comparing Africa's decades-old democracies with older democracies like those in Europe or the US. And they said specifically that Africa's institutionalization of democracy is still too young for us to lose hope at this point. On the question of whether democracy is more than voting, participants agreed that democracy is sometimes conflated with voting because people feel the most democratically active when they vote or feel like they are participating more directly in democracy. Another element that ties to that conflation they shared is that political parties are also often more vocal about certain issues around the time of elections. However, they widely agreed that this is misleading, especially in this region, where campaigning involves empty promises and the handing out of food parcels and T-shirts in rural areas, for example. One participant suggested that, or asked rather, isn't that showing how corrupt the system is? And then said that this situation is especially disheartening for young people in rural areas and townships who are very demotivated when it comes to elections, because they know that when it's election time, that's the only time democracy matters. That's the only time they're being valued, and that's the only time where they are seen to exist. Then on the question of how young people could be better included in democratic processes, young people highlighted to us that, yes, there is youth exclusion, but there's also a disinterest from youth. So there's two things at play, and they link this partially to how democracy is presented and managed. They shared that youth has lost interest in democratic engagement because they no longer believe that government can provide for their needs. And one of the biggest areas that need attention so that youth inclusion can be improved is civic engagement. Then ultimately, it was concluded that democracy remains the preferred form of government and does better than other models of government at upholding human rights. But there is no perfect governance model that can be said to be the best for upholding and promoting human rights. Democracy, young people argued, allows for discourse and deliberation, but it is not possible for all ideas and wishes of the people to be incorporated. Democracy is flawed, they argued, but remains the only governance model fit for promoting human rights. Then, related to civil society, and as I mentioned earlier, one of the driving questions for this project was whether Southern Africa needs a cross-border civil society network that works for the promotion and development of democratic values. Participants were not steered in that direction at all, but it became an organic conclusion over both days when we started asking questions about civil society. So on the question of whether young people feel that civil society organizations cater for their needs and expectations, it was shared that mostly they do, and that that civil society organizations are also more reflective of the causes that society support than their governments. Therefore, young people shared that civil society organizations should be a first point of call for citizens. On the question what civil society organizations should stop doing, start doing, and continue doing, it was suggested that civil society needs to be more engaged with what political parties do wrong and where they fall short. It's also necessary then for greater engagement between civil society organizations themselves to find shared interest and take joint action. Young people shared that they expect civil society to enhance collaboration between civil society organizations, be careful of using exclusively Western models in their actions, but rather remain true to African democratic values, and then be realistic about their capacity and influence to not do things for their own benefit, but rather for the greater good. Then in the third chapter, we look at existing civil society networks, international and African. These are by no means an exclusive list, but the organizations listed there were chosen because they were of interest, because of the work they do and the kind of reach they have. So we looked at the Africa Drive for Democracy, which is a recent initiative and a conference rather than a network, but focuses on some interesting issues. Then the Pan-African Human Rights Defenders Network, the CHARM program, the West Africa Democracy Solidarity Network, WADEMOS, which also inspired us to conduct field research in Ghana because of the reach and the type of work that WADEMOS does. Then Civicus as an international civil society network, the National Endowment for Democracy, and then we also discuss people-powered or the Global Hub for Participatory Democracy. And really what we did was just provide a brief overview of these organizations, why they were founded, what they focus on, who are they funded by, and what the impact has been. And some of the key findings there in this chapter is that Africa's civil society sees great value in networks, and then human rights is a central concern for civil society organizations, and protecting human rights defenders is important for sustained democracy. Important to highlight also, and this is discussed in the paper, is that the foundation for the civil society network, the cross-border civil society network rather, that youth advocated for during the consultations, those foundations are already in place through the Southern African Council of Non-Governmental Organizations, or SAF-CINGO. And its scope briefly, and I'm quoting there from SAF-CINGO resources, is to contribute to the promotion of democracy, peace, and good governance in the SADC region and beyond, in line with national, regional, and continental instruments. Then to strengthen and consolidate public policy research and advocacy in the region for poverty reduction and sustainable development programs at regional and national levels. Strengthening members and civil society partners' capacities, partnerships, and networks for influencing SADC member states towards inclusive, equitable, and people-centered regional integration and development. And then finally, institutionalized engagement and coordination on SADC programs to fulfill objectives contemplated by Article 23 of the SADC Treaty. SAF-CINGO includes member organizations from all the SADC member states, and in the paper, we discuss some suggestions for how to deepen engagement between civil society organizations and SAF-CINGO, as well as SAF-CINGO's network and the SADC governing organs. Then, in the final chapter, we share some of the insights gained during our field research, where we consulted representatives from WADEMOS, the Ghana Center for Democratic Development, or CDD Ghana, the West Africa Civil Society Institute, WACSI, the Media Foundation for West Africa, the West African Network for Peace Building, and finally, the Institute for Democratic Governance. And I'm just going to list some of the findings. Firstly, West Africa is not a perfect example, but civil society organizations in the region have been crucial in bringing about democratic advances and championing human rights. Secondly, identifying key convening points for civil society organizations is important. In this case, we learned that elections have been a central convening point for several of the civil society organizations in West Africa. And where some have tended to focus more on election observation, others have kind of stepped into that gap to focus on other important and relevant issues, creating a balance. Then, thirdly, regional crises should be addressed as such. There is strength in numbers. I'm quoting there from the forthcoming paper. Countries in the region had, at the founding of these organizations, experienced identical or similar issues, and civil society recognized that it could have more influence and impact if civil society networks worked together to address the problems of society at the regional level. And then finally, we found that strong links to regional bodies can deepen impact. I'm going to close with recommendations. I don't want to go into too much more detail because we would like you to read this special report when it is published. But in terms of recommendations, I suggest that many of the issues experienced in individual countries in the region have spillover effects and should be treated as regional, not national concerns. Civil society can collectively raise these issues with SADC organs. Youth input should be prioritized at both the national and regional level in Southern Africa. Civil society can be the vehicle through which this takes place. Civil society should adapt creatively to digital technology to overcome the threats it poses and make it work for it. And then finally, as I've said above, there is strength in numbers. Small civil society organizations should partner with bigger organizations, and bigger organizations should provide that seat at the table. I'm going to close it there in terms of presenting findings of the special report. And we're going to turn now to the next section of our webinar. And I would like to encourage our audience, if you have any questions or comments, please make use of either the Q&A function or the chat function. And you are welcome to pose these questions to any of our speakers. We're going to be conducting an exchange based on these findings, but also other questions more broadly. And as your questions come in, we will see how we can best address them. I would also like to share with you a Mentimeter. We would like to ask you to please tell us in 2025 what comes to mind when you hear the word democracy. This could be a one-word answer, a small phrase. Please make use of the code to join this Menti and share with us what comes to mind when you hear democracy. I'm now going to turn to our panel, Hope, Ruth, Nossi, and John. And I would like to start with you, John. What do you make of the findings that I presented from the special report on democracy and civil society solidarity?
Thank you, Isabel, and greetings to all colleagues on the call. Speaking from West Africa Civil Society Institute based here in Accra. So a little bit about WACCI. WACCI was created by the Open Society Initiative for West Africa in Senegal, and then we kind of moved our setup to Accra. It was created to, cover up a gap that, democracy actors saw in civil society across the region. And that is that of capacity. So WACCI is there to provide capacity strengthening for civil society organizations in West Africa to be able to deliver on their mandates, irrespective of their background or thematic areas. Given that we were created by the Open Society Initiative for West Africa, which is, of course, more or less a baby of the Open Society Foundations. But it was very African and also very West African in outlook. And so you can tell that our foundation is democracy, and that's why democracy and civic space and human rights matter to us as an organization. And it's what informs our activities across the region. I think this is an excellent report in the sense that it captures the critical issues around democracy and governance across the region, not just West Africa, but the entire continent. I think what we feel in Ghana is almost the same as what others feel in South Africa, what others feel in Tanzania, what others feel all the way in Senegal. So it highlights most of the issues, but more particularly how the youth feel And I think that it is true that most of the youth are getting disillusioned about democracy, because democracy is not really delivering as they expected, especially around the material conditions. And I say the material conditions because I don't really want to say development in this case, because when you say development, it becomes so abstract that people don't even understand what that means. But the material conditions are access to water, access to energy, sources, access to housing, and all of that. And these are basic stuff that really affect citizens across the region. And you can kind of square that with how the youth are not really involved or engaged in government or in governance of their countries, because the leaders are mostly old folks, and they don't really see, they representing their interest. I mean, there are a few kind of reforms across the region, but I think that there is still more that could be done in terms of how to include the youth. There are other issues that is also impacting civil society. Civil society in the region, but also youth participation in the region. And I think that you highlighted that of technology, how technology is playing both roles. One is to provide access to voice, but also at the same time a threat to voice. And then we can talk about that more in detail later. And we also have security issues that are kind of defining how citizens see democracy. And that's why I hardly would want to feel that this is a whole representation of feeling across the continent, because different regions have their peculiar issues. So, for instance, in the Sahel, we can't really ascribe the situation, the democratic backsliding, to issues of material conditions, right? Or issues of development. I think the most important thing for them right now is security. And I think that when you think about security and you think about the military and all those kind of things, it doesn't sound counterintuitive that they can really deliver. So you see a lot of young people who feel like, okay, if the security situation is that dire, then it only makes sense that military leaders step in and act. There are other things that is also fueling the perceived legitimacy of these military leaders, and we can count technology and artificial intelligence, the rise of technology and artificial intelligence to that. Now we see a lot of doctored videos that go around, even localized in a way that you sit here in Ghana and you hear a non-English speaking military officer or leader speaking fluent English and trying to influence populations outside their own jurisdictions. So, for instance, in Ghana, you see young people and other people feeling that these military officers are endearing, they are legitimate, they are doing so much, and all those kind of things. Most of that would be fake if you look at it very well. But also, we have really low AI digital awareness, so people will take some of these things hook, line, and sinker, but it doesn't truly reflect the major feeling or the majority of feeling for most African youth. The data speaks to itself, and you've already mentioned that. So I'll leave it here for now, and I can come back and provide more information. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Just for a little bit of additional background, Ruth, Hope, and Nosipo were part of the cohorts of the youth consultations. And if you visit our YouTube channel, but I will drop the link in the chat later, you will see some of their own reflections, but also other participants' reflections on some additional questions that we asked. And we made this series of videos called #WeAskYouth. One of the questions is, if you were president, what would you change? So I highly encourage you to go and watch that. But just before we move on, to some other discussion points, I also want to ask you, Ruth, having been in the youth consultations and now at this phase where I've presented some of the findings, what do you make of those findings? What do you think of the process?
Hi, everyone. Thank you to SAIIA for having me, and I'm really glad to see a good amount of participants. I think, firstly, when it comes to the overall publication and it's soon to be released, it's very reassuring to see that, firstly, the youth voice, youth opinions are actually not just matter, but we see outcomes from it. Because oftentimes young people are invited to consultations, and usually it's a matter of we're there to speak and then we wait for outcomes and nothing comes to pass, or we don't get updates. So it's reassuring to see that SAIIA has followed through with this. And I'm not just speaking as somebody who was part of writing this, but as a young person who was in that room. But I think what's critical is that from when we had written this last year to it's being released soon this year, I think sentiments still remain the same, if not worse. I'm seeing the responses here, and I was like, wow, okay, people have very strong views of what they think democracy is today, and it's not positive, right? But I think what is reassuring is that people are exercising a critical element of democracy, which is holding their leaders accountable. So these views definitely reflect that aspect of democracy. So while we do see this democratic aggression happening, we do see that young people are still exercising what is critical to democracy, which is obviously freedom of expression, which is transparency that they expect, and which is also holding their leaders to account. So while this is negative, that, you know, democracy is not what we want it to be, it's reassuring for me as a young person to see that young people are very active when you are looking at what young people are doing online or in person, and are very willing to express their views regardless of what the consequences may be in their context. And I want to link it to having been in Zimbabwe earlier on this year in May. I was with the International Youth Think Tank, and we were invited to assist in training youth who wanted to run in the 2028 election. So they're already starting early, which was amazing. But even in their own context, where there are critical consequences for them being critical to their state, young people are willing to suffer the consequences for them to see what democracy needs to be, in their opinion. So while there are cons, I'm seeing pros amongst young people. So that's what's reassuring for me, and with the overall consultations outcome. I'll leave it at that.
But thank you so much. Yeah, as you were responding, I'm also looking at the Menti, and it's quite interesting to me how certain words have changed in size, but I do like that hope is still one of the prominent ones. Certainly there are some negative responses there, but it I think reflects the broader sentiment, and I think the concern that people have about where democracy is going. Well, as the Afrobarometer data and the data of other institutions have revealed, people still prefer democracy, but there are some concerns, and to address it, the time is really now if we're going to work towards sustainability. So I now want to turn to you, Hope. Looking at the Mentimeter responses, I want to ask you, do you think we're drifting further away from what democracy is meant to be? What do you think democracy is meant to be? Is it a constant? Is it consistent? Let's hear from you.
All right, thank you, Isabel, for that question, and good day, everyone, to our audience and panelists. I think that is a really interesting question, specifically also mentioning the fact that we're referencing to the responses that we're seeing, particularly looking at the fact that we see hope, corruption, lies, and danger being the most exclaimed, terms in terms of how people relate to how they see the narrative and perceive democracy. And I think also it's relevant in the sense that it comes from a perspective of how people have been experiencing democracy, in the sense of they experiencing corruption, they're experiencing the reality of lies and deception, and even also the sense of how dangerous it has presented in terms of the threat to people's livelihoods, in terms of the socioeconomic economic issues that they're facing. But I think also to put this into context, I like to also relate democracy to a slowly rusting ship that is rusting from the inside. And as you look at this, it's not a sudden dramatic event that happens. It's progressive, and it is a process in which, as much as we are seeing the fact that there is a diminishing trust value in terms of citizens, but also in the sense of how democracy itself has begun to play out. And in that sense, within the context of this, we are seeing how the slow rusting of this ship called democracy is resulting in a more infrastructural and exterior weakening of the system. Therefore, looking at itself, unfortunately, being phased to vulnerability as it's fragile. And that is why we are seeing how there has been this progressive expansion of various challenges that democracies are facing across the continent. And in addition to that, I think it's very much important that we also take a step back in really understanding the framing of democracy and what it was supposed to mean, particularly looking at South Africa's unique history and how rather democracy was kind of seen as a progressive starting point in reform and transformation versus the realities that we're facing now, which is a democracy that is not only declining in terms of the trust deficit of the constituencies that are engaging in it, but also looking at the fact that the value of democracy itself has depreciated. And therefore, we start to actually question, is democracy actually suitable for our reality? Is it the best means and alternative in terms of how we want to see our society governed? And I think really looking at the stats in terms of people's responses, it's quite also evident that there is a great erosion. There is an evolving polarization that's also occurring. But at the center of it, I think it's the fact that people can also acknowledge that not only are the citizens in danger, but democracy itself is in danger and a threat to itself. And how do we begin there in that process of not only diagnosing, but also treating the patient of democracy, or rather the slow rusting ship? Because the idea is not to patch and paint the exterior body, but really to acknowledge that perhaps it is time for change, and not rather looking at it from a reliability, maintenance, engineering perspective. So I really am happy that we are questioning the reality of our current democracy, but also in the sense that we are bringing it back in how we experience the reality of democracy in the sense of how we feel. The corruption culture that has infiltrated citizens' livelihoods and the trust that has depreciated in terms of, is it actually worthy to vote? Is it actually worthy to even invest in civic education, in empowering people in how to engage in various democratic practices? Because at the end of the day, we are not just looking at it from a constitutional perspective and preservation of humanity, but we're also looking at it from a perspective of, it is a failed deliverance institution. And therefore now the output and the realities that it was supposed to deliver does not resonate with the aspirations that we had in terms of what we could have out of democracy.
Thank you for that really interesting response. I'm going to link to your diagnose and treat analogy and turn to Nosipho. Nosi, I want to ask, so a year ago when we held the youth consultations, we interviewed you for one of the videos, and we asked you, how could civil society solidarity within a region promote democratic culture? I'd like to ask you that again now, and also ask you why you think that civil society solidarity is important. Do you think it can, as Hope said, help to diagnose and treat the problems that we're experiencing?
Okay, I hope I'm audible. Isabel, many thanks for this opportunity, and greetings to all my fellow panelists. It's great to see, following the youth consultations, my other colleagues, Ruth and Hope, and many thanks to those at the Embassy of Sweden as well for today's event. And of course, Happy International Day of Democracy to everyone who's in attendance. You know, I like the analogy that Hope actually used of the rust and the sinking ship, and the analogy of not just merely patching and painting, but how to treat it, which ties in very well with how I wanted to answer this question, because a year later, I now see and realize that civil society has such an active role that it can play, but most importantly, it has an active role that it can play in the very nature of reform and reforming that trust from the ground up. I think even as we're seeing with erosions of multilateralism, unilateralism, the global order being pulled into question and reforms for it, it's more vital now than ever to work in civil society in conjunction with our respective regional organizations to address that trust from the ground up. And what I would definitely say in answering the question, but in a way that links in both democratic practices and civil society, is a paradigm shift, honestly. And honestly, this paradigm shift can be explored, I think, through a very interesting phenomenon known as citizen assemblies. It's something that has also fascinated me because in the wider landscape of climate change, sustainability, we have to face the reality that within democracies, leaders only have a fixed term in office. They are dealing with their short-term goals and not necessarily dealing with so many of the long-term goals that can better enhance society and the world. So countries that are facing socioeconomic issues, but also the impacts of climate change, whilst it may be taken by democratic leaders that, yes, we will address this, they only have a 4-year span at most part. So we have to be cognizant of that reality. So what I think is that through a paradigm shift through what's known as citizen assemblies, it's a fascinating phenomenon in the sense that you select 150 representatives at random within a country, ensuring that the demographics are of course the same and that it must account for women, men, and disadvantaged communities and people of color. But at the core is that every citizen at some point has to participate on a rotational basis. And I think incorporating that practice along with civil societies and having it being run and facilitated by civil societies can characterize that paradigm shift of reforming democracy as a concept and that we know of spanning from 200 years ago. I mean, South Africa itself as a democracy highlights the fact that we've been pushing for reform change for how many years in the UN Security Council? So looking at the ground up from local to global and within our communities can start that shift of addressing that rust and slowly but surely curing it as opposed to the simple patching and painting of it. But obviously, taking that into account, it's important to understand the fact that as I'm suggesting this, it will create an extra layer because trying to create dialogue and exchange does take a lot of time. But as South Africans, that's what we're good at. I mean, look at now, we've recently had, not too long ago, the national dialogue, of which the president took inspiration from our history and track record of dialogue and sitting together to address commonalities and common issues. So whether we like the outcomes of the national dialogue or not, that is an example and it's exemplary in and of itself of that very topic and nature of bringing in people, bringing in civil society, bringing in global citizens. So I think more than anything, that is the key stepping stone for creating that enabling environment.
Thank you for that answer, Nasi. I think some interesting innovations that you've highlighted there. And I'm just looking at the Q&A section where there is a question saying, should we not be asking how we can reimagine even our politics so that we can understand democracy? The person says that I think we've given our agency away to politicians and hence we can't hold them accountable and yield democratic outcomes. So with that question in mind, John, I'm going to turn to you again and to ask you, do you think young people feel more let down by the failures of democratic governments than older citizens? I think that's one of the things that stood out for me when we were doing the field research in Ghana. Someone that we consulted said that often youth are more open to alternatives to democratic government because democracy or democratic governance is the only form of government that they know, and it's letting people down in terms of socioeconomic change. Do you think that could be linked to levels of support observed for unconstitutional changes of government? And how would you say, should we be reimagining even our politics to understand democracy better?
Thank you, Isabel. I always find that comment very disturbing, that people say young people are looking at alternatives to democracy because they have always lived in a democracy. I feel it is an insult to young people and belittles them, because young people don't have to live in to get to understand it. You have young people who have read history, they understand the history of their countries, they can speak to some of these issues, but we keep making that point that because they didn't live in a military government or in a dictatorial government, they cannot really see that democracy, military governments are not an alternative. I think that when they say that they are looking for alternatives, they're not looking for military governments. Let's be clear. When young people say that they're looking for alternatives, they're not looking for dictators. They are looking for a kind of system or a kind of governance that would include them, that would rule in a way that reflects their own expectations and all that. If you look at what young people are looking for, they're looking for inclusion, they're looking for transparency, they're looking for accountability, they're looking for rights and freedoms, and all these are ideals of democracy. So the question is, what is really happening to the kind of democracy that we are practicing? It means that our democracy has deficits. And if something has deficits, it's important that you fix those deficits. So how do we begin to fix those deficits? Now, if you look at the kind of models that we are all practicing, most of these models were inherited. Ghana practiced, we experimented with the Westminster model. It didn't work out. We experimented with the American model. It didn't work out. We kind of had a fused kind of system. It is still not really working out very well. So the question is, what is really happening? It means that we are importing, but we are not kind of localizing it in a way that really reflects our own conditions. And to also say that the system in which African governments or political parties inherited, they kept that, in the sense that most of that were winner takes all, and because of that, a political party comes in and doesn't include anybody from the other side, doesn't include those that are considered as less powerful or less privileged, and they move on. There is no policy continuity. Another political party comes, abandons totally everything that the other political party has started with, and then starts their own stuff. In such a context, in such a system, corruption breeds, corruption thrives, there's no accountability and all that. And after 4 years or 8 years, they are gone and we are replacing them. And it is really very sad. Just yesterday, I was having a conversation with someone, and then he said something very profound. He said our democracy only elects, and that's a fact. We only elect people, and that's it. After 4 years, when we feel like they're not doing what they're not delivering, then we do what? We come out and vote them out, and then bring another set of people to deliver as expected. And the problem is that when they are delivering, they are not even including young people. Or let's say that they are not including young people enough. Look at our population. Look at our countries. Almost all the countries, the biggest population is the youth. But we don't have representation. And that is very sad. And I think that if we're looking at reforms, where we should really start in terms of youth representation are the political parties themselves. We can't wait to now get to govern, then we start thinking about it. It starts with the political parties. If we don't reform our political parties to be youth-focused, to focus on including the youth from that ground up, then we are just wasting our time. It won't really work. Because once you are there, once you're in government, it is very difficult to now include others if you haven't carried them throughout the process. So I saw the comment, the question, and I thought that was a very important question. I think we should be looking at our politics, how we perform our politics, how we include, how our political parties are even organized. Do we even have quota systems for young people in our political parties? How are we deliberate about including them in leadership positions? There's a bit of a small progress in Ghana. So now we have a new government that just came. It's just about 9 months in power. But you can see that the government is very deliberate about youth inclusion. So from the political party level, before they came into power, you could see a clear direction around including young people, giving them or letting them occupy certain leadership positions. And some of these young people have now transitioned from the political party leadership into government, and they are handling key roles. And they are doing fabulously well, at least for now. And it is something that should be encouraged. It is something that others should be doing. But the problem with some of these is that it is a decision that is not really a policy. Let's say that maybe it's about a leadership decision. Some leader feels like young people should be included, but it should be a policy. Political parties should have policy documents that state that young people must be included. Our governments must have quotas. In this particular case, it is very important. And if we don't get to that point, I think it would be really, really challenging to get you to their role in society. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that really comprehensive and I think really important answer, especially on what you mentioned about alternatives. It doesn't mean less democracy or not democracy, but just something needs to change in terms of how democracy is functioning. And I think that links to Hope's answer from an earlier question, where she mentioned that the kind of sentiments that we saw reflected in the Mentimeter really draws from people's experience with democracy, and that lived experience feeds into the understanding and broader feelings that people have about democracy. Thank you also for addressing the Q&A question. I see there's another one that's just come up, and it is specifically for Ruth, Hope, and Nosipho. So I'm going to give each of you 1 minute in that order, Ruth, Hope, and Nosipho, to answer how do we then, as youth, reconstruct democracy to its essence in comparison to what it is today. Ruth, any thoughts?
Thank you so much for the question. I think it's a very critical one. It links exactly to what John said. John, you were speaking facts through and through. I kept nodding, and I feel like my head would fall off. Because I think when it comes to reconstructing democracy, we need to go back to what John had mentioned. So it's not necessarily democracy is a sham. We want a military government. We're not saying let's jump to the extreme, right? We don't have to go from one to another complete end of the spectrum. It's a matter of, like John said, how do we localize democracy, right? Did democracy exist in the African context? We need historians, we need our political scientists to start looking back. Because in academia, and I'm a master's candidate, so I love this question, right? When we talk of coloniality, we talk of epistemological violence, it's all about the West claims an ownership of a concept that has existed for years in other countries, in the global South, for example. So when we look at what can we do to reconstruct democracy, we need to look at what worked in the African context and what needs to be changed. Now, we're not saying let's throw away a Western concept, because the fact of the matter is that we can learn from each other. We can do knowledge sharing, right? But let's not go to the extent that we must just copy and paste, because we're all different. Every country is different. We need to embrace this difference and look at what worked in the African context, what didn't work, where are we now, and then we adopt that. And like John mentioned, I think it was Ghana, correct me if I'm wrong, but they tried different models. So we need to be okay with experimenting and realize that sometimes it won't work. We won't have perfection immediately, but we will keep complaining for years to come. The generation after Gen Z will also complain if we just sit here and just talk about, oh, democracy is a problem, it's terrible, it's Western. Okay, but how are we localizing it? How are we involving practitioners and academics? How are we getting the knowledge from people who studied this for years? How are we talking to our historians, our political historians, and understanding what worked in the African context? So when it comes to reconstruction, my key word is localized, as John said. We need to look at what happened in the past and what can we use for today and for the future. So I'll hand it over to the next speaker. But thank you so much for that, John, because I think that's something that we need to start talking about. And I don't think it is a critical conversation yet.
Yeah. Thanks, Ruth. Okay, Hope, your thoughts. How do we well, how does youth reconstruct democracy?
Well, thank you. I think that's a fantastic question, and I'm just going to build on what my fellow, panelists have spoken about in terms of localization and also just really bringing back democracy to the people. It's for the people, therefore it should be influenced and shaped and driven and led by the people. And I think to just really bring this into context, I think also, as Ruth mentioned, that we need to also go back into history. Therefore, let's take the textbook of, democracy, dust it off, and really see what is its true nature in storytelling, especially when we want to put it into an African context. But rather also in terms of just the idea of reconstruction by the members of, society, I think it's very much also treating democracy like a community garden. It's dying out, there's erosion, therefore we need to bring in the fertilizers, the water, the youth creativity and energy, and we need to begin to really cultivate and bring the soil back to life. And really that means working together in farming true democracy that resonates and speaks to our needs, and implanting seeds that are true to how we would like to realize and live in a reality that is truly democratic. And I think this also will also introduce, measures of accountability, because just like a plant, you know that if it's dying out, you are an irresponsible plant parent. Therefore, continue to water it and give it what it needs by becoming more nurturing towards it. So therefore, reconstruction really comes from removing the gatekeeping fences that democracy only belongs to the politicians and those in parliament, taking control of that from the narrative and also in how we're shaping it, and most importantly, working together really in planting the true seeds that will actually resonate with what we want, so that we live a true democratic reality and also bear fruit to it and enjoy, of course, the fruits of it.
Excellent. Thank you for your passionate responses. This is making for a really good discussion. So let's see what Nosipo has to say.
Okay.
How can youth reconstruct democracy?
I definitely have difficult shoes to fill in now after all spoken. But what's interesting is I love the garden analogy, because you have smack bang touched on what I wanted to propose, and that when it comes to that reconstruction and reform, if you haven't seen what's happening in Nepal now, I highly suggest everyone online see what's happening in Nepal. The Gen Z generation is not having it, and they've taken measures into their own hands, not only going as far as being radical enough to sadly burn the facilities of the Nepal parliament, but they've even gone as far as to run elections and votes on Discord. And if that's not the most generational Gen Z youth coded example, then I don't know what is. But I would definitely start off by saying that is a very interesting example of that reconstruction. But what Hope was saying actually touches on what I would like to propose, which is the phenomenon of ecological democracy. So ecological democracy in and of itself, essentially, it's a political framework that advocates for the radical transformation of the existing liberal, democratic, and capitalist institutions, but in a way that prioritizes well-being, human well-being. It emphasizes participatory governance, environmental rationality, and I do see that as a political framework. It's something that fascinates me as well, and a topic that I would love to delve into more as I progress and advance my studies, because what's interesting is that at the heart of it, it prioritizes inclusivity, and it's radically grounded in the importance of economics and expanding on the existing structures that are in place, but then it fosters ecological resilience and sustainability in the long term. So going back to the existing liberal democratic positionality that only prioritizes your short-term elections, young people, civil society need to start, as Rita said, experimenting. And I see that framework of ecological democracy being very interesting and something that young people can take up with regional organizations, with their local community, experiment with it as a political framework, because at its very core, it critiques liberalism and capitalism. It highlights ecocentrism, meaning it places ecological health and interconnectedness at its core. It also embraces integration of everyday practices, so focusing on material practices in daily life, what works, what doesn't work. So channeling that energy not only from the climate perspective, but to the local perspective. And it also touches on the importance of, so much knowledge stems from local communities. In the climate change, we keep speaking and hyping up indigenous knowledge of indigenous communities. I mean, just look now, COP30 will be the first ever COP that's being held in the Amazon in Belém. there's so much knowledge of our elders within our communities, our townships, our slums, no matter where you are in the world. So taking their expertise as the wise and looking at what young people are facing and starting to just put action into practice of addressing, okay, what is a problem we face in our community? What is it that our leaders, local leaders in power are not paying attention to? We see the cracks within the plant or the issues that are stopping the plant from growing. So let's snip it into place and then actively weave out that practice of it, because it also incorporates a lot of grassroots engagement, which I think grassroots engagement will be very key and very exemplary and necessary in the wider geopolitical space and local communities insofar as recalibrating and reform is allows. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think these are brilliant examples of why youth should be leading and more meaningfully included in decision-making and in policy-making processes. So I want to then ask again, Hope, because we also linked our theme for International Day of Democracy to South Africa's G20 presidency. You were recently involved in the Youth 20 or Y20 process. Can you tell us a little bit about that, why it was important, and then why you think there is a reluctance to let youth lead? And I'm using that language because it's one of the things that also came out in the youth consultations and that I do discuss in the paper. Please share your insights.
Thank you. I think overall, the Y20 was interesting in the sense that it really presented a great opportunity for us to really move from just mere tokenistic youth representation to actually seeing young people at the table, going at it together and really engaging and trying to really form and shape policy recommendations. And I think it was really important in the fact that it legitimizes the contributions of youth and our capacity to lead. But in addition to that, I think also it really was interesting in the sense that we always speak about an intergenerational dialogue, but this time it was a generational dialogue in the sense that we as young people were able to have conversations. And unlike the older generation, disagree to agree, build consensus, challenge one another, but most importantly, really aim at really going to the cracks of it and being able to really advocate and speak for what really matters, and for us to really be able to put on the table the agenda that resonates with us and our urgency as young people. So despite the fact that, of course, we did not have a final communique outcome, it was still a progressive and, recognizing the fact that young people showed up. I think right here, it's not even a matter of the fact that not only did we have that final communication come out, but rather looking at it from a perspective of, will those recommendations that the youth delegates worked so hard on see the light of day in the G20, being tabled, taken actually serious, so that it further gives to credit to the work that has been done, because such platforms are, of course, important in terms of how we also are bringing forth and showcasing youth leadership, changing the narrative around youth equals inexperience, and really showcasing the capacity and the value that we bring to the table. Therefore, the UI20 was only just the beginning of really putting at the forefront what young people can do and how determined we are and the level of diplomacy we're able to also carry in terms of our engagements with our fellow also foreign delegates. And I think also at the core of it, really, it's about how youth advocacy in its own nature is one that also can bring so much influence in shifting agenda and really crafting new perspectives and taking over the narrative. And I think for right now, everyone that was at the Y20 is really expecting to see those recommendations being tabled and also seeing light of day, with the older generation, of course, being at the forefront of leading and discussing this and really also determining the future of these implementations, seeing day of light. And I think it's quite important in the sense of the fact that not only do such platforms further validate our role, our importance, and the responsibility we have, but also I think it really also proves to the fact that this should not just be an annual seasonal forum that happens. We need to continue conversations. We need to further institutionalize and legitimize, rightfully so, the role of young people, even to a point of actually becoming a advisors. Because honestly, the conversation around establishing youth councils is not original anymore, and in itself is starting to also present a problem. Because once again, as much as people argue there's too many political parties emerging, we do not need further more youth councils that also work in isolation, but rather looking at it in terms of a convening of young people who can play key advisory role and influence the key agendas that young people have outlined as a priority within the G20 presidency and even going forward. So overall, the Y20 is a great step in the right direction. Let's further actually legitimize, recognize, and celebrate youth leadership and capacity. But most importantly, let it not stop here. Let us actually see intentional relationship building coming in, where government and leaders will say, come in, and not only are you going to have a seat at the table, but we will pay attention, listen to you, take you serious, and ensure that they provide that support that we need so that we can realize the outcomes of the priorities that we are pushing forward.
Thank you so much. We have about 15 minutes left of our scheduled time, and I'm going to use that 15 minutes to ask Nossi, Ruth, and John a question each. They will be different questions. So to Nossi, I'm going to actually look at the Q&A section. There's 2 new questions that have come in. I'm going to ask you to answer Sifiso's question. The question is, how do we create an atmosphere that will encourage a battle of fresh ideas, especially a platform for young people, taking into consideration gatekeeping and apathy?
Okay, that's an interesting question. I'll try and answer it as best as I can. So I myself have seen the empowerment that young people get through the creation of platforms that allow young people to have a voice and feel that they have their seat taken, their own seat at the table. Apologies for that. So as a young South African, I'm a member of Chatham House's Common Futures Conversations, and that, under the stewardship of a global think tank, gives young people a seat at the table, literally, and through its organized global platform, Hope can also further expand on it as well, as she's part of it. It allows you to not only connect with young people from all walks of life in different parts of the world, but it creates that enabling environment whereby you can give your voice actively and shape policy making. And what I've always tried to do and leverage throughout my CFC 10 years as a young South African is also taking advantage of that and bringing in the viewpoint of South Africa and of Southern Africa as well, amidst different young people who may be speaking from viewpoints that are slightly more Eurocentric, slightly more, EU related, bringing in that extra flair. And it's so important as young people in South Africa to utilize those platforms where they're there. It's so important to not disqualify yourself and to not disqualify yourself in a platform into thinking, this is too Eurocentric. There's no point. That is the perfect opportunity for you as a young South African to come in and add your Mzansi flair of how to advance policy making from a way that will be radically different from everyone around you. And I've seen the empowerment for myself that I've gained through that platform of adding Mzansi flair to topics that so many young people all over the world would have never realized. So many of the young people within that community didn't realize the importance of G20 in South Africa, what it means for the global South, what it means for the continent, the fact that when it comes to tackling this issues such as disinformation, which I've mentioned, how that can be addressed in areas such as the townships. When it comes to AI, I, for example, proposed a policy on how to advance artificial intelligence to South Africa's public diplomacy, and even had the fortunate opportunity of actually expanding the knowledge of young people more about South Africa's foreign policy, how South Africa positions itself in the world in terms of non-alignment. So actively engaging and searching for those opportunities, no matter how big or small it may be, is a crucial stepping stone. But I also think this should also be an important note, and also my personal thanks to think tanks, because of SAIIA, because of whether it's SAIIA, whether it's Chatham House, whether it's any think tank, having the youth element to it should not be taken for granted, or should never be taken in a tokenistic manner. The very fact that we are speaking on this platform as a result of the youth consultations, as a result of the Embassy of Sweden, Youth at SAIIA, this in and of itself is that enabling form in practice and in real time. So I think it's crucial to look for those enabling environments. And also, this is just my personal plea to think tanks, that they should never underestimate the work that they do for young people, because they do amazing things that empower us as young people in ways that we could have never imagined or even seen.
Thank you so much, Nossi. What a powerful response. Ruth, I'm going to turn to you to answer Tato's question. The question is, how do we activate the youth into working to improve transdisciplinary collaborations in order to impact society quicker, as well as endorsing disciplines that need young people to invest their skills and improve nation building? And before you answer, I just want to encourage the rest of our speakers as well. There's a very interesting exchange happening in the chat. If you would like to engage with people there and respond to some of those comments, you are more than welcome to. Okay, Ruth, over to you.
Thank you so much for the platform and for this question. Again, I really love the responses. I love the engagement because this is very touching to me as well when it comes to transdisciplinary collaboration, or as I'll rephrase it, interdisciplinary collaboration. I'm going to give a little analogy I heard on TikTok. So TikTok is a very great place to learn, but you need to clean up your For You page and make sure that it is actually conducive to your mental health. Just just a warning with that one. But I heard this medical doctor, an intermedical doctor on TikTok. I think they are based in the United States, but the way in which they approach this is also very critical. So they mentioned that the person is Black. So they mentioned that they have a lot of Black patients who come in and be misdiagnosed. So story of our lives as Black people, right? So they'll be misdiagnosed, but now this individual or rather this doctor realized that, no, let's look at where is this individual based. So they had a respiratory issue. I'm not too sure what exactly it was, but the point is they had a respiratory issue. But for him to understand what was the cause of the issue so that they're not treating the symptom, but they're treating the issue at its core, was to understand where the patient lives. Now, the patient lives in a place that was full of asbestos, for example. So the issue was caused by asbestos. But the issue was caused by the fact that I think in United States history, I'm not too clued up on that, but certain race groups had to live in certain areas, much like the reality of South Africa was. So now Black people were historically relegated to particular areas that had asbestos. So that was contributing to the respiratory issue this patient had. So this doctor realized that if he did not look into where the patient was staying, this individual would keep coming into the hospital to treat a symptom, but never the actual cause of the health issue. So he realized that there was something called medical sociology that he had to take into account when he is treating his patients, so that he can help his patients not waste money to keep coming into the hospital when we could just figure out what was the cause of the issue and let them solve the issue from the actual crux. So my point is that's a very clear example of transdisciplinary/interdisciplinary collaboration that is very key. So I want to link it to the second aspect of the question, which is endorsing disciplines. I think we need to be very careful with how we want to approach this, right? Where we endorse some disciplines over others, because I believe that we need disciplines to coexist so that the way in which this doctor solved that problem can be the way in which we can approach a lot of societal issues. A medical doctor can't be a medical doctor in isolation, because there's things like, history and why people live in certain areas that impact patient health. So it necessitates the doctor to either go and learn sociology or collaborate with someone with a sociological background. So when we say endorse disciplines, I don't think it should be a thing where we must endorse, you need to go be an engineer because there's more money there and there's job security. It needs to be a matter of, we need people with science backgrounds to engage in humanities. We need people with humanities backgrounds to engage in the sciences so that we can work together and actually solve societal issues together. Because now the thing is, if we start working in silos, we will start layering different solutions to the same problem, when if we just collaborated, we'll be working really well. So my first thing is that firstly, we need narratives to change online. It's a very dangerous narrative online, especially on TikTok, where we are painting some degrees as serious degrees and other degrees as not important. So while we need to go into our degrees understanding that, yes, there are certain job opportunities that may be more difficult to attain, so you need to go in a way. So I'm not saying that don't choose a degree based on the job opportunities, but what I'm saying is, let's not create fear mongering, because there's different ways to approach different degrees for young people. So the first thing is that online, change the narrative. One degree is not more important than the other. My medical example shows how critical the humanities and the medical field work together. So that's the first thing. Secondly, we need our universities and academic space to create the platforms for there to be this transdisciplinary/interdisciplinary collaboration. So now I understand that there are a lot of young people who would love to be cross-faculty. I did that in my first year, but I couldn't continue until third year because it was clashing with my module's timetable. So we need our university spaces to be conducive of that. And actually, I believe it should be a requirement for you, if you are in the sciences, to come into humanities and learn what is called science communication. Because now if you're here to help us solve a societal issue, but you can't communicate the sciences in layman terms, then you're not doing your job. So you need to come to us, but we also need to go to you and understand the basics. We cannot operate in silos, right? And then the next thing is there's ownership on our part. So while the university space does not allow for us yet to do this interdisciplinary collaboration to the extent at which we wish to, we can take research into our own hands. We can start researching, as a student. There's so many resources available to us. If you just go onto Google and search sociology or search introduction to international relations, introduction to, statistics and all of that stuff. You can even do online courses that some of which are free. There are Harvard courses that are free. I think they're called MOOCs, if I'm not mistaken. You can just look that up, but we need to start taking ownership and try and learn for ourselves until the space that we're in can let us learn. So that will be my very long-winded response to this question, and I hope it helps.
Thank you so much, Ruth. I do think it did help. That was really insightful. I'm going to ask the last question of our webinar to John. I'm busy reading a book by Professor Simone Chambers. It's called Contemporary Democratic Theory. And in a section of the book, she discusses value versus legitimacy. And she writes that, quote, democracy might be the right thing to do, but if it has failed to listen to your grievances or answer your calls for help, then you might need more arguments to stick by it in terms of crisis, close quote. So we know the challenges that democracy is facing, and we know that there are problems. What would you say to those people who want to stick by democracy in its time of crisis?
Thank you. I think this is a very interesting question. But before I even come to that, let me just respond to one of the
absolutely
here by Moyo, which is also very related to the comment I'm about to make. He ends his comment by saying that democracy in 2025 looks like a play, and it is true. He talks about the issue, politics now feeling like it's about power and personal gain rather than service. And I think that it boils down to how we look at our politics, how we look at how we run our democracies. People get into office for power, and it's because we see governance as power rather than service. We need to get to a point where, when you see something as power, you definitely want to abrogate everything to yourself. You definitely want to influence, even if it means that in doing so, you hurt society, and it is wrong. If we begin to see ourselves as servant, I think that would change, and it would begin with a lot of advocacy, letting people understand that we need to serve rather than fight for power. And I think that young people can take the leadership in that respect, and we are already seeing that a lot. Young people want to serve; they want the opportunity to be on that platform to serve, to contribute to their societies, and it is something that we should encourage and encourage our governments to do, and our political parties to do. The point about democracy, I will reject anything that is not democracy, because I'm yet to see anything that tells me that the ideals of democracy, transparency, accountability, rights, respecting freedoms, and all that is anti-African. I'm yet to see it. And of course, the sickness, or let's say the weaknesses of democracy, or let me say the weaknesses of democracies that are not practiced well, and that's the corruption and all those issues that we are bringing up, we are talking about, is because we haven't really innovated in a way that serves us. But in such a situation, in times of challenges like these, I don't think the alternative is to look for a dictatorship or is to look for a military government. I think that even in this, I think it was one of our colleagues here, I think Hope, who gave a metaphor of a rusting ship, right? And you don't throw the ship away. You begin to work on it, right? You have your garden, you water it. You know the kind of thorns and weeds that would affect your plants. You need to uproot them. How do we do that? I think that should be the crux of our efforts, not to think about an alternative. An alternative shouldn't be a choice. Yeah, so that's what I think, and that's what I want to share. It's been a pleasure joining all of you, and also to join brilliant young folks from across the region. Thank you so much. I learned a lot from you.